They shipped me up to what they call the sleep room, and they gave me all of these electroconvulsive shock treatments and megadoses of drugs and LSD and all of that, and I have no memory of any of that. Nothing of that time of the Allen Memorial or any of my life previous to that. All gone. Wiped.
Would it be entirely over the top to suggest that we're living in a society which is actually in some way mentally ill?
Well, it's a phrase that is neat and apt in the sense that I do think we are not fulfilling our purpose. We're not thriving. We are, in fact, in the process of destroying ourselves.
Hey, this is the second installment of a two-part series. Go and watch the first one for a brief contextual overview of the system and a rundown of where we're at. Whilst the first video dealt with setting up the big picture of the system, this video will add some further context to the malignant forces at play before outlining a way on how we, collectively, can refute the system. I'll be first looking at a thinker whom I deeply admire, who holds a cold light to the reality of the malice of the system we find ourselves in. That thinker is Darren Allen, often aligned with the anarcho-primitivist movement. Allen notes in his seismic book 33 Myths of the System the toxicity of our modern techno-industrialist civilization we are all imprisoned within, and ultimately how it wreaks havoc on our mental health and dismantles the human psyche. In his provocatively chaptered piece, The Myth of Mental Health, Allen looks not at the individual, but the system as the cause and perpetrator of the pervasive mental anguish we are subjected to. Allen outlines the interconnectedness of the system and how that in turn incubates mental illnesses as a product to be distributed and then cured by the very system that evokes it, aka the modern pharmacological industry complex, whereby the system serves in creating illnesses and selling the cure simultaneously. Moreover, Allen puts forth the idea that disputes the illness in mental illness, noting the fact that illnesses belong in the objective reality. A viral pathogen or a bacterial fungal infection are illnesses rooted in reality. Mental illnesses, on the other hand, have no material basis, immaterial and in the realm of the panjective psyche. Sure, they change the mind-body, but only in the same way that learning an instrument or playing a game does. They reshape the neural pathways, but the abstraction of these illnesses leads to a mass diagnosis far beyond the scope of rationality. Allen proposes that the process of diagnosing mental illnesses is as follows. Patient has illness X because they display symptoms Y and Z, their behaviors, which are symptoms of X. It is self-referential and therefore cyclical in its definitions. Allen goes further in addressing the cultural malaise of modern psychology and mental illnesses. Medicalizing psychological problems allows a pharmacratic state to root out the undesirables of the system. For instance, John can't sit still at work processing data on spreadsheets. Therefore, John has ADHD. Prescribe him Ritalin. Then he can function better in the workplace. John's well-being is not the root concern of the pharmacrats. It is in fact the fact that he will not abide by the societal norm of working and grinding. Therefore, his inability to resign himself to the system and its demands is the problem, not his inability to focus on Grebarian bullshit jobs. To this end, well-being and leisure, the stuff that gives life its mosaic textures, is only necessary in order for the worker to decompress before submitting themselves back into the system. If we could be the desired robots found in dystopian literature and did not need the breaks between work, we would not get the breaks. All of this, Allen suggests, shunts from view the case of misery, the system and the ego which feeds it. Both systems and ego work hand in hand in the modern day, atomized and individually focused society. Allen concludes this chapter on mental health in the contemporary era with a pertinent message to all of us within the system. This taboo, that the authority of psychologists and the pseudoscience of psychology rests on religious illusions, rests upon the wider taboo of the entire medical disciplinary wing of the capitalist system, that the best way to deal with a so-called mental illness is to improve reality. For the doctors, therapists, politicians, managers, academics and journalists of the capitalist market system, society may be to blame, but serious attempts to deal with the stress, loneliness, confusion, boredom, fear, and alienation of living separated from our communities, our nature, and our own selves by allowing us to return to these domains is out of the question. You aren't unhappy because of a fall in your serotonin levels, or because you don't have a sufficiently well qualified therapist, or because you're not doing enough meditating. It can't be because you're forced to spend all your life running on a hamster wheel with lead boots. Getting off the wheel is unthinkable. As unsayable as the greatest taboo of all in psychology, the word guaranteed to strike fear into the heart of every mental health professional: sanity. In short, the system in offering the solutions to the issues it created is an illusion, a distraction. It's fluff. The root cause, the problem itself, is the system. Anything short of dismantling said system is ineffective, and simply improving reality in the small parameters we are allowed to enact change to the system will not work. Therapy and pharmacology exist to make sure you get back on the hamster wheel of work and grind. They have nothing to do with your happiness or well-being. I am, in this observation, reminded of a scene in Louie, which hilariously deconstructs the futile attempts to alleviate the symptomatic effects of something that sucks, no matter how you square it. During a PTA meeting, Louie and the other parents are discussing ways in which the fatigue experienced by students can be alleviated. They put forth academic theories such as Reggio or Montessori. However, Louie cuts through the bullshit to address the core root of the problem. School sucks. It just does. He is met, of course, with dismissal from parents and teachers alike.
It's my first PTA meeting.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for coming. The fatigue problem is what was identified in the first quarter of the school year as being a marked decline in the spirit and interest and energy of the kids here, usually around noon or right after lunch.
It's because of the lunch. They aren't given enough time to eat.
No, it's not that. They're being demoralized. You fill them with academics. You don't tell them who they are.
In my opinion, it's because of the competitive nature of the school, of the children.
I've been reading about this Reggio teaching method from Italy. It's like Montessori, only it's a little bit more creative.
When are they supposed to dance?
It's the academics. This place is still stuck in the 70s. Who still teaches math anymore?
We've been talking about introducing some competitive sports.
I think our kids just need to be allowed to play more creatively.
You are all way off. This problem
Isn't it just... It's school, right? So, I mean, school sucks, right? I mean, you do what you can to improve it, but it's not... in the end, there's a limit. Because it's school. And school sucks. Remember?
If we replace the institute of school with the system, we find the same conclusions. Any attempt at alleviating anything but the root cause of the issue is met with skepticism. No, it can't be the prize system we have invested centuries into preserving. It must be a peripheral problem, something that is abnormal or subversive on the part of you not fitting into it.
Suffering is a mistake, or a sign of weakness, or a sign even of illness, when in fact, possibly the greatest truths we know have come out of people's suffering. That the problem is not to undo suffering or to wipe it off the face of the earth, but to make it inform our lives, instead of trying to cure ourselves of it constantly and avoid it, and avoid anything but that lobotomized sense of what they call happiness. There's too much of an attempt, it seems to me, to think in terms of controlling man rather than freeing him, of defining him rather than letting him go. Mm-hmm. And it's part of the whole ideology of this age, which is power mad.
Interestingly, on the notion of mental health diagnostics, one glaring omission runs rampant in the discipline of mental health academia. The very foundation of psychology fails to account for the influence of culture or nurture on human behavior. Which brings me on to my next point, introducing weird culture. Joe Henrich, a professor of psychology at Harvard University, found that most psychological studies were conducted and assessed by those living in Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies, aka weird. And when using comparative data that was available, discovered that those living in weird societies consistently occupied the extreme end of the distribution, making them one of the worst subpopulations one could study in generalizing Homo sapiens. Essentially, when looking at how we, in weird societies, are mentally, we're fucked. We occupy the extremities of both sides of the spectrum. And the problem with that, of course, is that it skews the data for all psychological assessments. If we weren't the dominant societal force on the planet, one might look at the data a lot more clearly and assess that the culture they promote is far more deranged and mentally ill than the norm. However, as we are the dominant culture, the one thing we can't assess is the fact that we are the ones assessing ourselves as fucked, but unaware of the prison we're in and how we're degrading mentally. Or, as Erich Fromm correctly assesses, modern academic and experimental psychology is to a large extent a science dealing with alienated man, studied by alienated investigators with alienated and alienating methods. The society that the weird occupy is deranged, but its homogeneous status as a civilization of progress means that we inherit the bias implicit in a system we can't look outside of. To a tribesperson in the Americas during the colonial days, this was well known. Modern man, with their obsession with extracting wealth and power, was seen as a sad sickness to their communal way of life. And now we've ravaged the world and made everyone sick. We can't see outside and remember the faces of healthy people, outside of the sanatorium we've created for ourselves. In Oliver James's book, The Selfish Capitalist, James explores the links between how the new post-Fordist world of work has redefined the working world and rocketed the rate of mental health diagnoses. Echoing a lot of the malaise that Han discussed in his idea on the Achievement Society, James discusses how the birth of what he coined selfish capitalism, which in essence is the neoliberal winner-takes-all competitive nature of contemporary capitalism, gave rise to what he calls the Affluenza Society. This Affluenza society is a socio-cultural condition consisting of materialism, status chasing, and job insecurity. These elements condition us to form a foundation of anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and substance abuse. Again showing that it is the system that engulfs and evokes our collective societal mental breakdown. James uses his work as a clinician to present an objectivity to this phenomenon often conveyed through cultural and social theoreticians. Famously, he used cross-country comparisons which show a correlation between higher distress in English-speaking neoliberal societies that highlighted a link with a higher desire to pursue materialism and poorer well-being. In the GCPH study conducted on selfish capitalism, James found that, on average, people in English-speaking nations were twice as likely to experience mental illness. The societal link, both on the level of clinicians, sociologists, and cultural theorists, all agree on the same notion. Origins of the global mental health epidemic is on us. Our system, our inclination, proclivities for status, commodities, and our innate desire to extract power and wealth is collectively destroying our minds. In essence, we are suffering from industrialized capitalism and its intentions. What the thinkers I've explored thus far state is quite clear. A faceless, centerlessness system that is amorphous and omnipresent dictates a society run on the merits of achievement as a form of labor, and materialism, social comparison, and status obsession operate in the background, forming a status quo of judging one another. Of course, combine these elements of the system, which are arguably the totality of it, as it cannot function without us all doing the aforementioned detriments, will only lead to emotional turmoil. So, what can be done? Well, a lot of the solutions are explored by the thinkers I've discussed in this video. Let's start with Fisher. At the end of Capitalist Realism, Fisher explores how we can convert mental problems into effective antagonisms. He writes, "Affective disorders are forms of captured discontent. This disaffection can and must be channeled outwards, directed towards its real cause, capital. Furthermore, the proliferation of certain kinds of mental illnesses in late capitalism makes the case for a new austerity, a case that is also made by the increasing urgency of dealing with environmental disaster. There is a liminal as well as a practical case to be made for this new ascesis." Fisher evokes the usual fiscal use of austerity to call for a reining in of the proliferation of capital and its consequences in order to correct the individual within society. He goes on to illuminate a helpful, optimistic tone. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities have disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the grey curtain of reaction which has marked the possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. In essence, Fisher talks about how the omnipresent nature of late-stage capitalism and its oppressive default mode via its pervasiveness has lulled the systems and its presiders into a false sense of security in that nothing will change and that the people will stay lulled into their sensory overload bliss, when in fact the opposite is more likely to happen. When a spark happens now for a system so big and so pervasive, the results are cataclysmic in scale. A similar sentiment is echoed in Yanis Varoufakis' book Techno-feudalism, in which he posits the idea that because power is so centralized and concerted in a dwindling minority, the attack on the system is actually easier. Whilst the system is amorphous, faceless, and centerless, it's also, ironically, easier to target. The globalized system is the largest cohesive system that mankind has ever had to deal with. The modes of its control and centralized systems of power leave it more vulnerable. Monopolization of control that has been allowed to cement itself now leaves a center to the centerlessness of capitalism. A hack on AWS servers or the takedown of meta platforms, for instance, leaves the techno-feudalists with minimal control. Moreover, a global boycott or collective sanctioning of just a few companies could cripple the global economy and give us a much larger bargaining chip in the fallout. Now take this to the scale of all facets of the system and we begin to outline radical change and a blueprint to collectively reject a system that seeks to control us. However, the glaring problem to this solution is the disunity amongst the masses, to put up a unified opposition to this system and pave a way to a viable alternative. This is where we can explore a solution by Oliver James and the inversion of his idea on selfish capitalism. James outlines how we need to move towards a transitory system of unselfish capitalism. Whilst the root system would remain, the pragmatic appeal of implementing such a system is it would be transitory, a system implemented in lieu of a systemic overhaul, which we desperately need but would take a lot more blood, sweat and tears. I'll move on to the critique of this idea shortly, but it's worth positing as a pragmatic, immediate solution. As I said, transitory system. Unselfish capitalism would be a system a lot more designed around creating a cohesive community as a source of resistance against the atomizing force of capitalism. Essentially, it would entail capitalism tempered by social policy and institutions that protect well-being, and strengthening our emotional immune systems at individual and community levels. In fact, in the study I referenced earlier, where James compares the so-called selfish capitalist countries with the unselfish ones, what he finds in those societies that move away from the Protestant individualized ideals of Western capitalist democracies, though are few and far between nowadays, report higher levels of happiness. This is arguably achieved by rejecting the ideal of individual status obsession and towards fostering community within society. We could do this by encouraging the building of third places. I actually made a video on this before, so please go and check that out. Reinventing back into community projects, youth clubs and places of congregation, and even shortening the workdays, automating the bullshit jobs we have, and introducing more incentives to encourage one another to spend more time with each other, paternity leave, more vacation time, etc. In short, we need to place compassion at the heart of the system. Whilst not eroding the fundamental model of the system, it does alleviate the pressure cooker of the contemporary mental health time bomb. In 2008, James outlined this vision in The Guardian. We desperately need, and before long I predict we will get, a passionate, charismatic, probably female leader who advocates the unselfish capitalism of our neighbours. The pitch is simple. Not only would reduced consumerism and greater equality make us more ecologically sustainable, it would halve the prevalence of mental illness within a generation. However, as you can probably tell, this has not come into fruition. In fact, whilst his critique of selfish capitalism is spot on, the naivety in James's argument is that capitalism can correct itself. Whilst yes, pragmatically we can and should move to an ideal of unselfish capitalism, the problem is capital itself. A system that seeks profit above all else will not put the needs of the individual above the system itself. No, the system itself exists to maintain the system. Oppressing the masses and lulling them into a dopamine prison eternally, atomizing them from one another, enriches the system far more than it does in fostering community building and rebuilding our emotional health. James's solutions are naive, but more tangibly pragmatic in striving towards today. Think of it as a compromise in the future before a complete dismantling of the system. The reality is far more than the abstractions and notions of critical theorists and philosophers. We are being killed off. Engels called it social murder. That is the unnatural death of someone, not through the result of violence, but instead through social, political, and economical oppression. Suicides, malnutrition, and dying from the elements of homelessness, anxiety-induced stomach ulcers, depressive hedonia resulting in an indulgence of fast food, pornography, and social media, leading to an aversion to real social world interactions. Loneliness is more deadly than smoking in the long term, yet we're becoming more, not less atomized in the final stages of capitalism. And now there's concrete links to the ideological imposition of capitalism and higher than average death rates. Mortality experts released a study that found millennials and older Gen Z are dying at an alarming rate, far higher and faster than the generation that preceded them. The cause? The stress and demands of the achievement society in the modern world. A burnout society, quite literally. We are the generations born into the collapse of capitalism and upward social mobility, and into the age of unfettered access to the information age and social media, all of which have been a blight on the mental and physical health of humanity. Now I'll expand the scope beyond thinkers already discussed in the video series.
For that, as you say, we had turbulent times of change, right, where things change very quickly, where you even lose track of reality, right? But there is a huge difference, because when I speak of social acceleration, I do not just mean turbulent times, right? Fast or periods of fast change, but the fact that you have a social fabric, a very solid social fabric, like the modern capitalist world order is. It's surprisingly solid because it's been around for 200 years or more than that, right? And within this logic, to sustain the logic, you have to accelerate, to grow, and to innovate. And that's totally new in history, right? Of course, we had periods of social breakdown, for example, of revolution or change, right? But then a new order is established. And normally, cultures of all forms try to stabilize this order, to keep it as it is. While in our modern society, we have to permanently accelerate, grow, and innovate technologically, socially, culturally, with fashion waves and so on, just to maintain the institutional structure as it is.
Your conception of resonance, how did this come about, and how can it help us deal with this social acceleration?
Yeah, I mean, when I did this acceleration book, after I published it, a lot of people thought, oh, Hartmut Rosa is the guru of deceleration, just slow down, right? And I thought, well, that's too easy, because number one, we cannot simply leave the economic order and the other orders as they are and slow down, because then our institutions would break down. But also, slowness is not an end in itself. I don't like a slow fire engine, right? Or a slow internet connection. They are not good in themselves. So I wrote a small book which said, the problem of acceleration is if it creates alienation, if we lose the capacity to really appropriate the world and the people we interact with, right? The things we work on, contact with nature, if we lose that because we are too fast, right? So I said alienation is the problem, right? Acceleration is something that might lead to alienation, but not always, right? So I asked myself, what's the opposite of alienation? When do we have a non-alienated form of life? Because it's not enough in philosophy to criticize the existing order, right? If you just only criticize, you will never change the world, right? I think we need to find a conception of what could it mean to be non-alienated, to lead a good life. And this is how I came to resonance, right? We are non-alienated from life when we are capable of entering into resonance with each other, right? That means we are not just talking, exchanging information or insulting, right? But we're really touching each other in what we say, for example, right? And having a kind of transformative effect. And I realized that these forms of relationship or resonance with the world, right, is not just in dialogue. We can resonate with the tools we work with, right, with the nature we operate in, or with the music we play, with philosophy, for example, right? You read some thoughts, and in school sometimes you have to know what Kant says or what Aristotle says, and then you have to reproduce it. That's not appropriation in the true sense, right? It is when you start to think a bit like Kant, if you're capable of seeing the world through Aristotle or Marx's eyes also, right? So resonance for me is the primal, the most important mode of human being in the world, right? So resonance, I would say, is the opposite of alienation, and it's a limit to the acceleration, at least to acceleration good for us.
The clip I just showed is Hartmut Rosa, discussing his idea on resonance as a tool to engage and further our depth and understanding of the world as an antidote to the alienation that arises from modern living. Rosa posited the idea as a reaction against a phenomena he termed social acceleration, the meaning of which is all too familiar in the world we see today. Social acceleration can be defined as the contemporary desire to treat the world and ourselves within it as mere instruments. Thus, in doing so, we have an incessant need to optimize, control, and consume all facets of the world around us, rejecting the rich tapestry of meaning and warmth it could offer. So in order to resist alienation in the age of modernity, we must engage with the world in what Hartmut Rosa lists as the 4 axes of resonance. Firstly, we seek resonance through the horizontal axis, which are social relationships, family, community, friendships, as well as engaging within the civil discourse of the political sphere. We form bonds based on intentionality and depth, not transactional friendships, but nourishing, worthwhile relations. Secondly, the diagonal axis. This is the axis that connects us to the world of the material and the functional. Think of it as intentional labor. Marx famously lamented the end of meaningful labor in what he deemed the alienation of labor in the contemporary industrialized societies we occupy, where man is divorced from the meaning of his own labor. Rosa posits therefore an antidote to this: labor for the joy of doing so, creating things that talk back to us, that solve problems, or allow us to form an extension of ourselves. This can be in the realm of the creative, like me making this video, or a band practice, or building furniture for your own house. Or it can be in the realm of the educational, the learning of the world. Understanding the world we're in adds depth to the superficial veneer of the world today. The diagonal axis can also relate to sports and play. Not so much work, no, but the physicality of the world and stretching our potentialities within this realm to further enhance our interaction with the material world in humorous and fun ways. Thirdly, Rosa talks about the vertical axis. That is the existential, spiritual, and cosmic realm. That is, if you are inclined, the realm of the divine, the gods, the part of the world beyond the scope of our understanding, the magnitude and divinity of the world. This would be the engagement with the right hemispheric part of the brain posited by W.E.I.R.D. And for those more rational and atheistic, this encompasses the realm of the creative spirit, either through the consumption or creation of art, music, literature, or engaging with the appreciation of aesthetics more generally. Moreover, this axis also involves immersion within the natural realm. If there's one undercurrent that flows throughout this video, it is that the techno-industrialist world we've built for ourselves is sickening. So, escaping the urban sprawls and into the woods, deserts, mountains, beaches and forests in the quiet, harmoniously bliss that nature provides is a surefire way to engage with resonance and reconnect meaning and nourishment into your psyche. Finally, the internal axis. The internal axis is the realm of resonance with our internal selfhood. The physical self, which is listening to our physical needs and limits, not just blindly pushing it further and further into decay, and the psychological self, being in harmony with our own emotion, our own values, and maintaining a firm resistance to anything that gets in the way of that. Knowing right from wrong, even if the system feels like it is totalizing and eternal, the morality of oneself is resolute in its resilience, and in doing so it maintains a modicum of sanity in this insane world. In short, knowing it's insane and putting those boundaries up stringently to not be infringed upon in the realm of the self is possibly the most important part of resonance one can undertake. Moreover, on the last point of maintaining selfhood and boundaries in a world of relentless capital and extraction, I move on to another theorist who offers a profound insight into how we can collectively resist the demands of the system. Jonathan Crary, in his book 24/7, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep, discusses how modern capitalism has forced us into a continuous 24-hour cycle of work and consumption. The relentlessness and incessant demands of capital extraction and the demands on our time and attentions has rendered us exhausted. In short, the 24/7 cycle of non-stop engagement is a declaration of war on our capacity to rest and re-energize, the latter of which is fundamental in resisting the system. This is of course intentional, and Crary posits the idea of how sleep can be a form of resistance in itself. Echoing the adage of Timothy Leary, turn on, tune in, drop out, the act of dropping out of the system, the act of turning it off in a state of rest, enforcing an uncompromising pause on market participation, is an act of radicality. So what does this look like? Well, similarly to Rosa's internal axis, the act of setting up rigid and uncompromising boundaries goes a long way in helping one tune out the demands of the system. It is the antithesis of malignant philosophy of accelerationist growth that underpins modern-day capitalism. It is a simple yet defiant way of preserving one's energies for things they're better spent on, like art, relationships, and revolution. The act of resting in a world that demands your complete devotion to market growth and demands your constant attention is an act of radical non-participation. So, turn off your phone for a weekend, spend your time in idleness, sleep in late, acquiesce your working world to your needs. Sure, it can be hard in the rigid world of 8 to 6 p.m. commutes and office hours, but when you're at work, give only the bare minimum. Unless the labor fills you with spiritual joy, it is not worth it. Save your time for when you return home from work, to your family, your friends, your children. The ones you love and the things you love doing are the only things worth your energies. So spend your limited energy accordingly. Pivoting back to Byul Chung Han, whilst often criticized for his ability to accurately describe the problems without offering any real solutions, a critique that one could arguably apply to most left-wing intellectuals, does offer one solution in his analysis of the achievement society. That is the ability to reclaim the negative. This is one that, whilst idealistically true, probably doesn't fare well in the real world. Essentially, Han discusses how in the achievement society we are condemned and therefore imprisoned by our compulsion to say, I can, as a marker of how much we are willing to apply ourselves in the productivity society. He proposes we start reclaiming the negative in the sense of refusal, limitation, and saying no as a way of resistance. Whilst ideally this would be true and simple to do, the reality is far more convoluted. This also applies to the aforementioned theory of reclaiming rest by Crary. If we start individually saying no at work within the productivity society, we will quickly see ourselves drop from the job and replaced with an obedient worker or robot who is willing to go further and further to impress the superiors. This works more on an individual level. In other words, resist the internalized compulsion to always perform, to always optimize, and to always be better. However, therein lies the problem: the focus on the individual to enact the change. Sure, we can say no to social engagements, but work ones will quickly be met by disciplinary outcomes that detrimentally affect our financial circumstances. That said, however, Han does ironically propose some helpful individual remedies that can help us relinquish burning out. Han emphasizes that our society's hyperactivity and constant doing destroys the possibility of deep contemplative attention. He calls for forms of being rather than ceaseless doing. He proposes that meaningful culture depends on deep attention, as opposed to hyperattention. He suggests that boredom and idleness are not simply wasted time, but a necessary condition for reflection and creative potential. Whilst all this sounds good on paper, and it is a somewhat tangible goal to work towards, the problem again relies on the system allowing us time to contemplate and apply deep attention. Again, the solution relies on the charity of the system and not overhauling it entirely. Whilst idealistic and almost impossible to imagine in today's day and age, this notion of negation as a powerful entity has its roots further back than Han and Crary and can provide us invaluable insight into wherein the solution lies, which I will be touching upon shortly. But this answer to solve the mental degradation of our human spirit circles again and again back to our ability to collectivize, organize, and unite against the system, which in today's day and age is about as idealistic as it comes. We are fucked. The system has, by all metrics, successfully disbanded, atomized, and alienated the proletariat underclasses of the world. There is no alternative. But what if there was some point of hope we could refer to? Some place not long ago where collectivism was born out of the individualism of capital.
It was one of the most striking phenomena to see to what extent the ruling power structure could manipulate, manage and control not only the consciousness but also the subconscious and unconscious of the individuals. And this took place on a psychological basis by the controls and the manipulation of the unconscious primary drives which Freud stipulated.
We need to look back, not in today's atomized age of the individual, but back to the 60s, the last decade where collectivism had some standing in the Western world. And for that, we can look at one of the key thinkers of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, and his idea of the Great Refusal, a blueprint that is worth returning to as a means of deriving hope on how we can reclaim back our diminished agency within this system. Similarly to Han and the reclaiming of negativity, Marcuse proposes the idea of the Great Refusal, which is made up of 4 components. Firstly is the idea of negation, the one also put forth by Han too, as a form of resistance. That is simply the act of saying no to the totality of the system. This could be a multitude of different actions. The act of living off the grid, for instance, or the act of refuting the claim of the inevitability of capital, technology, and its pervasiveness both constitute acts of negation. Additionally, embracing the Luddite within us that rejects modernity and technological society. Essentially, don't play the games the system dictates, but reject that system altogether. The second component of the Great Refusal is to embody the spirit of the true outcasts and outsiders of the system, as they are best equipped at seeing through the system's false promises. Marcuse wrote this in the 1960s, so that would have been the radical student movements and people of colour. However, due to the acceleration of liberal capitalism and the role of identity politics bringing all creeds, sexes, sexualities and races under the same systemic umbrella, this poses challenges in the contemporary sense. The non-integrated groups of the society now tend to be individuals, atomized and floating alone outside of the orbit, left behind from the system, rather than those that choose to radically oppose it. But one useful way of framing it is to see who the system is against and consider why they are against them. What message are those the system are against trying to convey? Historically, this would have been communists for daring to advocate for the proletariat. Nowadays, this takes the form of those who are within the system but advocating for minor social democracy. In the US, it would be the Zoran Mamdanis of the Democrats, and in the UK, this would have been Corbyn or more recently Zach Polanski, all of whom are smeared relentlessly by the legacy media. But more radical would be those who are advocating for alternative systems themselves, anarcho movements, green movements, workers' party movements, etc. The trick that Marcuse implores us to do is to question, why are these people vilified in the media? What are they saying? Refuse their vilification and investigate for yourself. Chances are, if they're being vilified harshly within the public realm, they're trying to get a message across. A message that weakens the nexus of power at the heart of the system. Find out what that message is and sympathize. The third component links to the first component. That is accepting that the Great Refusal embodies not only the economic and political, but also the cultural and personal. Reject consumerism, reject materialism, reject the logic of endless growth and production, but it goes further than mere rejection. The Great Refusal also embraces the reclaiming of imagination, of art and aesthetic experience as models of negation. Spaces where we can find alternative ways of being and perception flourish. Support independent media, independent thinkers, independent venues who offer an alternative to the homogeneous culture. Most importantly, the role of this component is that one must keep alive the notion of utopian imagination. We must keep the hope, the vision and the goal at the forefront of resistance. We must always imagine the alternative and never give in our shared vision in order to simply maintain the status quo. The fourth component is by far the most important, and a notion that is sorely lacking in contemporary leftist discourse. That is the fact that the great refusal is not nihilism. It is not apathetic indifference. No, on the contrary, the great refusal is a dialectical no that opens up the possibility of a new yes. As Stephen Hessel, a former resistance fighter in Nazi-occupied France, laments in his surprising 2010 best-selling pamphlet Indigenez-vous, the worst attitude is indifference. There's nothing I can do, I get by. Adopting this mindset will deprive you of one of the most fundamental qualities of being human, outrage. It's an important epitaph to remember. Often the outrage and anger we have is dismissed as an us problem. Oh, stop caring so much about it, get over it, are used as dismissals when we have a very human reaction to seeing a grave injustice. So stay angry. Resist these dismissals. Be radical in your perseverance in reminding people of the injustice, not getting over it, not moving on. Demand answers. Giving up does nothing but abet the nihilism the system implores you to wallow in. Fuck that. There has to be an avenue of transcendence. Without this negativity against the systemic structures of society, society becomes static. It does not progress and it is devoured by the system. This negativity, this negation of the very system and its totality is a precondition for genuine and true freedom. I like Marcuse's idea of resistance via refusal a lot. It's action orientated. It's something we can all psychologically and philosophically get behind. It strikes a hopeful note on an endless series of discord and discontent. A lot of contemporary thinkers have become bogged down in the individualizing politics that define the oppression of the system. They forget the collectivization that is needed for genuine change and progress. Mobilizing individuals through a negation of the system is the key to start chipping away at its armor. We can tell people to buy less, like BDS and Israel, that genuinely hurt their modus operandi globally for a while. Or we inspire people through education. We can organize on our community around renegades and insert them into the system. That, whilst keeping the system intact, alleviates some of the system's worst pressures. And as the system has become more centralized and more authoritative, the weakness of the bourgeoisie feudalists is only more visible.
But everybody, in the midst of suffering, is given a chance to bear testimony of the human potential at its best, which is to turn a personal tragedy into a human triumph.
And above all else, we cannot resign hope. We need to instill within ourselves what Viktor Frankl termed tragic optimism. Frankl, an Auschwitz survivor and psychoanalyst, spoke of how the people in the camps who retained their sense of meaning and hope had far better rates of survival than those who did not. One of the reasons why, he notes, was tragic optimism, which he defines as, in brief, it means that one is and remains optimistic in spite of the tragic triad: pain, guilt, and death. After all, saying yes to life in spite of everything presupposes that life is potentially meaningful under any conditions, even those which are most miserable. And this in turn presupposes the human capacity to creatively turn life's negative aspects into something positive or constructive. And it is the last part of that quote we could do well to remember. Our infinite capacity to create and recreate systems that we haven't tried yet. But at the core of all of this is the fact the systems we're in keeps us isolated from each other, from a larger societal obligation, and from, most importantly, ourselves. As David Graeber quoted, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make, and can just as easily make differently. We can and must imagine and fight for new systems, ones that put well-being at the front of center. This hope of simply imagining, as Marcuse also noted, is an act of radicality in and of itself. Only when we give up does the system override all of us. And my final point is one beyond the theory of culture and society and more an appeal to the need for a revolution. First, on the community level. We're all in this together, and that in and of itself is a signal for community building. The key to everything I've said is community. Not virtual communities, but communities where we can reconnect and see in our wounds the wounds of others. In a previous video, I covered the importance of third places and how the dismantling of them has had disastrous consequences. The third place as a solace for the community is necessary to shift away from the isolating atomization that runs rampant in late-stage capitalism. So first and foremost, the community we seek to build requires immediate access. And you can start that now. Sure, we can get bogged down in the theory and the socio-political analysis of culture, but the simple fact is the world is a giant garden. We cannot be concerned with all of it all the time, but we can tend to our part of the garden. As Timothy Morton addresses in his work Hyperobjects on the incomprehensible magnitude of cosmic events, they are simply beyond the realm of conceptualizing. We have inhabited ourselves within these hyperobjects. Objects that stretch and envelop far beyond our own comprehension. What we need to do instead is to not undertake an attitude of taking on the whole hyper-object realm. We can focus on the nuances of life, the micro moments that give us meaning in the gardens in front of us. Create the community we want to see. We can build and support community treatments and educate the people around you. Second, on the spiritual level, we are in dire need of a spiritual revolution. In my previous video, I include the clip of Ian McGilchrist, a fantastic thinker. I spoke about how the world has fallen into the mechanized systemization of treating us all as components of a machine, not as dignified humans with the potentialities of all. We should do well to remember this. Reject what Jerry Z. Muller calls a tyranny of metrics. We are not to be measured on our efficiency anymore. We are humans with the wonder of the cosmos within us. We should do well to remember that which can be measured is not important, and that which is important cannot be measured. We live in the left hemisphere of the world, mechanized and technocratic. We've lost the profundity and spiritualist inclinations that gave us purpose. Do not fall into the trap of grading your life against the metrics that people are eager to apply to you. You are not a metric. We need to embrace the aesthetics, quality of the world, harmony, love, community, and purpose. The spiritual quest, away from machines that make up this techno-industrialist hellscape. So returning to my initial point, the way to dismantle the system and its havoc on our mind requires dismantling the corporate structures of oppression. It demands a new ethic, one that values empathy and self-sacrifice. We must reject the cynicism, indifference, and cult of the self that all tyrannies induce in those they dominate to keep them passive. We must reach out to our neighbors, especially those in distress and those who are demonized. We must uncouple from consumer society and turn away from the allure of our cultural narcissism. In effect, we must reject the demands of hustle culture, achievement society, and comparative social marketing, and embrace the individual as part of the collective. We need to feel rejuvenated spiritually again. Consume the beautiful aesthetics of the world. Feel the vigorous potentiality in all of human nature flow through you once more. Reject the cold machinery and metrics modernity forces upon us. There is hope. There always is. The dismissal of this idea is the end of everything as we know it. We need to energize the left away from the petty infighting on nuance and address the bigger picture. We are here to dismantle and build a new system, one where everyone benefits. Everyone can bask in the fruits of their collective labor, where leisure time is encouraged and we have a chance to reconnect to ourselves, ecology, and our communities. And then, only then, will we have a fighting chance. Thank you for watching Haiku. Please consider dropping a like and subscribing below. If you want to support the channel and allow me to continue putting these out for free, please consider £1 a month on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Or a subscription will do. Whatever you please. And until next time, peace.